My husband had been dead 3 years when a contractor pulled a key out of my garage wall. The bank manager's hands shook when she read the balance out loud. There was $8,742,116 sitting in an account with my husband's name on it, and the first phone call I got that afternoon wasn't from the bank. It was from a man I'd never heard of, asking if I'd found anything yet. Good day, listeners. It's Diane here. Before I continue, like and subscribe and leave your comment. I'm going to tell you what happened to me exactly the way it happened, in order because if I don't, you won't believe the middle of it. And I need you to believe the middle of it, because the middle is where I almost lost everything twice. My name is Diane Marsh. I'm 47 years old, and for the last 11 years I've worked as a billing coordinator in the cardiology department at Mercy St. Vincent Medical Center in Toledo, Ohio. I drive a 2016 Honda CR-V with 138,000 miles on it and a check engine light that's been on so long I've started to think of it as a dashboard decoration. I live in a 3-bedroom ranch house on Copeland Avenue in the Old Orchard neighborhood, the kind of street where everybody knows whose recycling bin blew into whose yard. My mornings are the same every day. Coffee, the 6 a.m. News with the sound low, a 15-minute drive past the same 4 stoplights, and a badge that beeps me into a windowless office where I spend 8 hours reconciling insurance claims that never quite match what the doctors billed. I am not. In other words, the kind of woman you'd expect a story like this to happen to. That's the whole point of telling it to you. My husband was named Richard Marsh. Everyone called him Rich, except his mother, who called him Richard the way you'd address a judge. We were married for 19 years until a heart attack took him on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years before any of what I'm about to tell you began. He was 61. He'd worked for most of his life as a mechanical engineer, first for a small manufacturing outfit in Maumee, and later, after that company folded in the early 2000s, doing contract design work from a workbench in our garage, building custom parts for local machine shops, the occasional patent drawing for somebody's uncle's invention. Nothing that ever made us rich, or so I believed. We weren't poor. We weren't anything. We had 2 incomes, a mortgage we were 6 years from paying off, and a habit of eating at the same Cracker Barrel on our anniversary every year, because Rich liked their chicken and dumplings and never wanted to try anywhere new. He was steady. He was quiet in a way that some men are quiet because they have nothing going on inside, and other men are quiet because they have a great deal going on inside and have simply decided not to share it with you. I loved him the way you love a house you've lived in a long time. Not because it's remarkable, but because every creak in the floor is familiar and you trust it to hold you up. I want to be honest with you about 3 things I noticed over the years, because you're going to want to know later whether I saw this coming. I didn't. Not really. But there were pieces. The first was a phone. In his last 2 years, Rich kept a second cell phone in the garage, an old flip phone he said was for calls with the machine shop guys, so I don't run my minutes down. I never asked to see it. Why would I? Rich wasn't a man who lied about small things, so it never occurred to me he might be careful about a big one. The second was a name twice, once at a 4th of July barbecue at his sister's place, and once mumbling in his sleep, which I only half remember and told myself I dreamed. I heard him say Holloway, just the one word, like a stone dropped in a pond. I asked him about it the barbecue time. He said, "Old business, nothing," and changed the subject to whether the hot dogs were done. The third was a storage unit. For the last 4 years of his life, Rich paid $41 a month for a 10x10 storage unit on Airport Highway that I didn't know existed until I was going through his bank statements after the funeral. And even then, I assumed it held old machine tools. I never went to look. I had a house full of his things to deal with. I didn't need a shed full of them too. None of that meant anything to me at the time. Grief doesn't leave room for detective work. I buried my husband. I went back to work 11 days later because Mercy St. Vincent doesn't run on grief leave, and I built a life around the shape of the hole he left. My daughter Kayla was 24 then and newly pregnant with my granddaughter, Emma, who is 3 years old now and who I watch most weekday afternoons, so Kayla can work her 2 jobs, days at a dental office, 3 evenings a week bartending, without paying for daycare she can't afford. That's the rhythm my life had settled into by the time this all started. Work, Emma, a quiet house, a husband 3 years gone, and I thought, 3 years understood. I was wrong about that last part. It started on a Thursday in April, on an errand so ordinary I almost didn't tell you about it as its own scene. except that everything after it makes no sense unless you understand exactly how small the moment was. I'd finally saved enough and gathered enough nerve to convert Rich's old garage workshop into a proper mudroom and laundry space, something Kayla had been telling me to do for 2 years. Mom, you're not going to start machining metal. Let the room be useful. I hired a contractor named Dennis Applewhite, a heavy-set, unhurried man in his 50s, who ran a 2-man outfit out of Sylvania and had done my neighbor's kitchen the year before. He and his nephew spent 3 days tearing out Rich's old pegboard, his workbench, the built-in shelving Rich had made himself out of 2x4s and stubbornness. On the 3rd day, a Thursday, April the 9th, Dennis knocked on my kitchen door around 2 in the afternoon, holding something small and metal between 2 fingers like it might bite him. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "you're gonna want to see this." He'd been pulling out a stud along the back wall, the one behind where Rich's old drill press used to sit, and found it hollowed out, a section routed clean in the middle of the 2x4, professionally done, not hacked. Taped inside, wrapped in a sandwich bag gone brittle with age, was a small brass key. No tag, no label, just a number stamped into the bow of the key. 0447. "Could have been an old bike lock," Dennis said, not unkindly watching my face. "But that's a safe deposit cut, not a padlock cut. I've seen enough of both. I want you to understand that my hands were steady when I took the key from him. I didn't cry, I didn't gasp. I said thank you, and I put the key in the pocket of my cardigan. And I told Dennis to go ahead and finish framing the far wall. And I went and sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes with the engine off before I could make myself go back inside. I didn't know which bank. I didn't know what account. I had, God help me, 22 years of marriage and 3 years of widowhood, and I did not know my husband had a hollowed-out stud in the garage wall. It took me 4 days to find the bank, and I want to walk you through exactly how, because the how matters later. I started with the statements I'd kept from settling his estate. 7 bank accounts. All of them accounted for, all of them closed or transferred into my name within the first year. None of them matched the number 0447. I called 2 banks near the storage unit on Airport Highway, since that was the only unexplained address I had for him, and struck out both times. On the 5th day, going through an old shoebox of receipts I'd never had the heart to throw away, I found a single deposit slip, 4 years old, from a Fifth Third branch on Monroe Street, a branch I'd never once visited with him, for an amount that made no sense on its own, $4,000 cash, no memo. I drove there on a Tuesday, my one flex day that month, having called in and told my supervisor I had a doctor's appointment. The branch manager was a woman named Renata Kowalski, mid-30s, sharp blazer, the kind of calm, efficient voice banks train into people. I gave her the key and Rich's death certificate and my marriage certificate and my own ID, and she disappeared into the back for what felt like 20 minutes but was, I later confirmed on my phone's screen time log, 6. When she came back, she wasn't smiling anymore. "Mrs. Marsh, I'm going to need you to come with me to a private room," she said. "And I think I should also get my branch manager." That's not something they say to you for a coupon booklet. We sat in a small back office with a round table and a box of tissues someone had clearly placed there in anticipation of exactly this kind of meeting. Renata had a folder in front of her that she kept touching without opening. The way you touch a stove to check if it's hot. The safe deposit box is registered to Richard T. Marsh, joint access never added. Opened in 2004, she said. "But Mrs. Marsh, that's not actually the account I need to talk to you about." The box led us to a linked account number, and she stopped and glanced at her manager, an older man named Phil Duquette, who had the particular stillness of someone who has practiced not reacting to numbers for a living and was in this moment failing at it. "There's a brokerage-linked trust account associated with the box," Phil said. "It's held under an entity called Baywood Holdings LLC. Your husband was listed as the sole beneficiary of that trust as of 18 months before his passing." He turned the folder around and slid it across the table, and I watched his finger stop on a number, and I watched Renata's hand actually tremble, just slightly, just at the wrist, as she read it aloud so there could be no confusion. No mistake in my hearing it. "The current balance as of this morning's market close," she said, "is $8,742,116.39. I have relived that exact sentence more times than I can count, and I still don't fully know how to describe what happens to your body when you hear it. My hands went cold first, genuinely cold, like I'd been holding ice, and then a kind of ringing started in my ears that had nothing to do with the room. I remember staring at the number on the page instead of at either of their faces because I did not trust my own face to do anything sensible, and I remember counting, absurdly, the seconds on the wall clock behind Phil's head. 1, 2, 3, 4. I got to 19 before I said anything at all. "That can't be right," I said. "We've confirmed it twice," Phil said gently. "I understand this is a shock. He was an engineer," I said, as if that settled anything. "He fixed valves for a machine shop in Maumee." Renata and Phil exchanged a look I would come to recognize over the following months, as the specific look bank employees give each other when a very ordinary person has just been handed a very extraordinary problem. "There will be some process to formally transfer everything into your name as surviving spouse and named beneficiary," Renata said. "It's not simple because of the LLC structure. The trust owns shares of Baywood Holdings, and Baywood Holdings is where the funds actually sit. I'd strongly recommend you retain an estate attorney before you sign anything or make any withdrawals. We can hold everything exactly as it is in the meantime." I nodded like I understood what an LLC-held trust was. I did not that day understand what an LLC-held trust was. I would by August understand it better than most lawyers. I left the bank an hour and 40 minutes after I'd arrived, and I sat in my car in the parking lot on Monroe Street. And for the first time since Rich died, I put my forehead against the steering wheel and I let myself shake, just for a minute, just long enough to get it out of my system before I had to drive home and be a normal person who picks up her granddaughter at 4:30. I told no one that day. Not Kayla, not my sister, not a single soul. I picked up Emma from her half-day at preschool, made her a grilled cheese, watched her build a tower out of measuring cups on my kitchen floor, and the entire time some second version of me was sitting very still in the back of my own skull, turning the number 8,742,000 over and over like a stone in a pocket, trying to find the side of it that made sense. That night, after Kayla picked Emma up, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I did what I do best, which is make a list. I've spent 11 years reconciling numbers that don't want to reconcile, and something in me needed to lay this out the same way I'd lay out a denied insurance claim, facts on one side, unknowns on the other, no feelings allowed in either column yet. What I had, a key, a number. A dead husband who had apparently been the sole beneficiary of a trust worth more than I would earn in 200 lifetimes at my current salary. A storage unit I'd never opened. A second phone I'd never asked about. A name, Holloway, spoken twice and never explained. What I didn't have, any idea where the money came from, whether it was legal, whether anyone else had a claim to it, or why in God's name my husband, who complained about the price of oil changes, had never once mentioned any of it to me. What I was afraid of, that it wasn't real, that it was some kind of mistake that would be corrected the moment a lawyer looked at it, and I'd be left not just without the money, but with the humiliation of having believed, even for a night, that my life had changed. And underneath that fear, a colder one, that it was real, and that it came with strings I couldn't yet see, and that those strings were attached to people who already knew about this money and had been waiting patiently for someone to find it. That second fear turned out to be the correct one, because at 6:52 that evening, while Emma was still building her measuring cup tower and before Kayla had even come to collect her, my cell phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, area code 419 local. I almost let it go to voicemail. I wish some days that I had, but something made me answer. "Diane Marsh?" a man's voice said. Older, gravelly, unhurried in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. "Who's calling? You don't know me. Name's Gary. I worked with your husband a long time ago." A pause, just slightly too long. "I heard you had a meeting at the bank today." I stood very still in my kitchen with Emma's measuring cups clattering somewhere behind me. "I don't know how you'd know anything about my day," I said. "Small world, Toledo," he said, and I could hear even through the phone that he was smiling. "I just wanted to reach out neighborly-like and ask, did you find anything? Out there in that garage of his?" I hung up. My hand was shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone into the sink. I didn't sleep more than 2 hours that night. I lay in the dark running the call over and over, trying to figure out how a stranger named Gary knew, within hours, that I'd been sitting in a bank office in a private room with the door closed. Someone had told him, which meant someone at that bank had talked, or someone had been watching, or worse, and this thought didn't arrive until almost 4 in the morning. Someone had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. and my visit to that branch had simply tripped a wire that had been strung years before I ever walked in. By the time the sun came up, I had made 3 decisions, sitting there with cold tea and a sleeping toddler's measuring cup still scattered on my kitchen floor. First, I would not go back to that bank branch or call anyone about this, from my home phone or my home internet, until I understood who might be listening. Second, I would take a personal day. Not a sick day, I don't lie about being sick, but a genuine, on-the-books personal day, and I would use it to find myself a lawyer who did not know Gary, whoever Gary was, and who had never done business with anyone in Rich's old circle. Third, I would not tell Carol, Rich's sister, anything, not yet. Carol and I had always had a cordial, slightly formal relationship, a woman who sent exactly 1 Christmas card a year and called it a relationship, but something about the timing of that phone call, less than 5 hours after my bank meeting, made me want to know a great deal more before I told a single member of Rich's family anything at all. I found Priya Anand 3 days later through the kind of unglamorous method that actually works. I called the Toledo Bar Association's referral line from a payphone-adjacent burner situation, which is to say from a library computer because I'd decided, rightly or not, that I didn't want this search showing up on my own home network or my own cell records just yet, and asked specifically for an estate and trust litigation attorney with experience in LLC-held assets. They gave me 3 names. I called all 3 from the Sanger branch of the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library on a Wednesday afternoon while Emma napped in her stroller beside me, and Priya Anand's office was the only one that called me back inside of an hour. She met me 2 days later at her office on Adams Street, a cramped, book-crowded space above a dry cleaner, with a whiteboard on the wall behind her desk that had, written in dry erase marker under the heading Current Villains, 4 names that had nothing to do with me, crossed out with satisfied-looking X's, and 1 blank line at the bottom waiting, apparently, for whoever came next. Priya was maybe 40, small, fast-talking, with the kind of dark circles under her eyes that come specifically from drinking too much coffee too late into too many nights. There was a coffee maker on her credenza that looked industrial, the kind you'd find in a diner, not a law office, and over the 8 months I knew her she went through, by her own count, 4 of them. "Okay," she said, after I'd laid the whole thing out, the key, the balance, the phone call from Gary, the name Holloway I'd overheard twice and never understood. "First things first, I like this case. I don't say that to everybody. Most estate stuff is depressing paperwork about who gets grandma's china. This has an LLC, a phantom business partner, and a guy named Gary calling you within hours of a private bank meeting. That's not depressing. That's Tuesday morning television, and I mean that as a compliment. Is that a good sign or a bad sign?" I asked. "Both," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee so dark it looked like motor oil. "Good sign, because it means there's a real story here, and real stories usually have real paper trails, which I like a great deal more than I like people's feelings. Bad sign, because it means somebody's been keeping tabs on that garage or that bank for a long time, and people don't do that for $8 million unless they think part of it is theirs." She had me sign a retainer, and then she did something I didn't expect. She told me, flatly, not to touch the money, not to touch the account, not to say a single word to anyone in Rich's family, and not to answer any further calls from a number I didn't recognize, until she'd done what she called a paper autopsy on Baywood Holdings, LLC. That took 3 weeks. I want to walk you through what she found in the order she found it, because the order is the whole mystery. The first thing Priya pulled from Ohio's Secretary of State business filings, public record, anyone can look, was the original 1998 formation document for Baywood Holdings, LLC. It listed 2 names as founding members, Richard T. Marsh and a man named Gary D. Holloway. "There's your Gary," Priya said, sliding the printout across her desk. "And there's your Holloway." The second thing she found, going through 26 years of amended filings, was that Baywood Holdings hadn't started as a trust holding shell at all. In 1998, it had been formed to hold the licensing rights to something called a dual-flow check valve assembly, a medical device component. Rich, it turned out, hadn't just fixed machine parts in Maumee. In the mid-1990s, working nights out of a rented bench at that same manufacturing shop, he had designed and patented a small valve mechanism used in early dialysis equipment, something that prevented backflow contamination during fluid exchange. In 1998, he and Holloway, who'd put up the money for the patent filing and legal fees, while Rich provided the design, sold the licensing rights to a mid-sized medical device manufacturer for an upfront payment, plus a royalty stream on every unit sold for as long as the patent held and the device stayed in production. That royalty stream, compounding quietly for over 2 decades as the device became a near-standard component in a whole generation of dialysis machines, was where the $8,742,116.39 had come from. Not a windfall, not hidden cash. 26 years of small checks, reinvested into a brokerage account inside the LLC that had grown slowly and then very much not slowly into a fortune neither man had likely imagined when they signed that original agreement in a Denny's parking lot, according to a notarized 1998 document Priya later found in 1998. "So it's real," I said, staring at the filing. "He really made this." "He really made this," Priya confirmed. "The question we still don't have an answer to is why he never told you a single word about it, and why, as of the last amendment filed 6 years ago, his sole partner Holloway isn't listed as a member of the LLC anymore at all." That was the third thing, and it was the one that mattered most. In an amendment filed with the Ohio Secretary of State exactly 6 years before my bank visit, Baywood Holdings LLC had been restructured. Holloway's membership interest had been bought out or removed, the filing didn't specify which, and Richard T. Marsh became sole member, with the trust that would eventually name me as beneficiary established the same year, which meant that, on paper, Gary Holloway had no legal claim to a single dollar of that money, which made his phone call, "Did you find anything out there in that garage?" considerably more interesting. I want to pause here and tell you about the personal stake I was carrying through all of this, because it wasn't abstract, and it wasn't small, and it colored every decision I made over those 3 weeks. In late April, right around the time Priya was digging through Secretary of State filings, Mercy St. Vincent announced a restructuring of the Billing and Coding Department, a merger with the hospital system's regional office that was going to eliminate, by their own internal memo, up to 40% of current coordinator positions over the following 2 quarters. I had 11 years of seniority, which helped, but I also had a supervisor who'd been cool toward me since I'd taken that doctor's appointment personal day, and I was, at the exact moment, I might have been sitting on $8 million, more worried than I'd been in a decade about losing a job that paid $41,000 a year. I didn't tell Priya that fear specifically, not for a while, but it sat underneath everything. Because if this all turned out to be a mistake, or got tied up in litigation for years, I still needed that job. And I still needed to be at my kitchen table every weekday afternoon at 4:30, when Kayla dropped Emma off, because Kayla's second job at the bar didn't end until close to midnight most nights, and there was no version of my life where I let my granddaughter down to go chase a fortune that might not even survive contact with a courtroom. It was Priya, in the second week of May, who found the recording. She'd subpoenaed Baywood Holdings' banking and communications records as part of formalizing my claim to the trust, standard procedure. She told me, whenever an LLC's ownership history includes a buyout that wasn't cleanly documented, buried in 6 years of archived voicemail transcripts the bank had kept on file for the account, something Priya said most people don't realize banks retain, and which I now believe every single person should know about, was a voicemail Gary Holloway had left for Richard on the Baywood Holdings business line, dated 14 months before Rich died. Priya played it for me in her office on a laptop balanced on a stack of case files, and I want to tell you exactly what it said, because it's the moment the whole shape of this changed for me. Holloway's voice, gravelly even then. "Rich, it's Gary. I know what the buyout said, and I know I signed it. But I also know that Valve was half mine on paper before your lawyer restructured me out of it, and I know you know that too. I'm not asking for trouble. I'm asking you to do right by me before one of us isn't around to argue about it anymore. Call me back." 14 months before Rich's heart attack, a man telling my husband on a recorded line that he believed he'd been cheated out of half of something worth, even then, several $1,000,000, and that he wanted it settled before one of us isn't around to argue about it anymore. "That's not a threat," Priya said carefully, watching my face. "Not legally. It's a guy expressing a grievance, but it tells us 2 things. 1, Holloway believed, right up until Rich died, that he had a real claim, buyout or no buyout. 2, he was tracking Rich's health, or at least aware Rich wasn't young. Combine that with him calling you within hours of your bank visit, and I think we can safely say Mr. Holloway has spent the last several years waiting to see who'd find that box. I asked her the obvious question, was the original buyout legitimate?
Had Rich, in fact, cheated his own partner?
That's what we need to find out before anyone sets foot near a courtroom, Priya said. Because if the buyout was clean, Holloway's got a grudge and nothing else. But if it wasn't, if Rich pressured him into it, or misrepresented the value of the patent at the time, then you might be sitting on an inheritance that's got a real legal cloud over it, and I'd rather find that cloud myself than have Holloway's attorney find it in front of a judge. That's the kind of lawyer Priya was, and it's the reason I trusted her completely by that point. She was never on my side out of loyalty. She was on my side out of a determination to find the truth before anyone else could weaponize it. It took her another 5 weeks, through most of June, working with an accountant she brought in named Walter Osei, a soft-spoken forensic accountant who communicated almost entirely in spreadsheets and the occasional dry aside, to reconstruct the 1998 buyout in full. What they found was this. The original licensing deal, signed in 1998, had paid Rich and Holloway an upfront sum of $340,000, split evenly, plus the ongoing royalty structured through Baywood Holdings, also split evenly per the original operating agreement. That part was clean, well-documented, unremarkable. The buyout 6 years before Rich's death was murkier. Rich had paid Holloway $612,000 for his half of the membership interest, a real number, wired and documented, not nothing. But at the time of that buyout, Walter's analysis showed the royalty stream Baywood Holdings was collecting had already grown to roughly $340,000 a year and rising, meaning Holloway's 50% stake was, by any reasonable valuation, worth considerably more than the $612,000 he'd accepted. Closer, Walter calculated to $2.1 million if valued honestly against its trajectory at the time. So he got lowballed, I said. He got lowballed if he didn't know the true trajectory of the royalty income when he signed, Walter said. Which is the actual legal question. Did your husband show him accurate numbers before that buyout, or did he show him old numbers or no numbers at all? We didn't know. Not yet, and that unknown became the center of everything that followed. Because 2 weeks after Walter finished his valuation, Gary Holloway's attorney filed a formal claim against the Baywood Holdings Trust, asserting that the 2018 buyout of Holloway's membership interest had been procured through what the filing called material misrepresentation of the entity's financial trajectory, and seeking either the return of his membership interest or damages equal to what that interest would be worth today, which, given 6 more years of growth, Walter estimated at just under $3.4 million. That filing arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday in late June. The same week, I was called into my supervisor's office at Mercy St. Vincent and told, not fired exactly, but identified for review in the department restructuring, with a final decision expected by September. I remember standing in the hospital parking garage afterward, holding both pieces of paper, the layoff review notice in one hand, the certified legal filing in the other, and thinking that I had never in my life felt so simultaneously rich and precarious. It was around this time that Carol Voss, Rich's sister, found out. I still don't fully know how. My best guess, which Priya shared, was that Holloway's attorney, in the course of researching Baywood Holdings' history for his claim, had reached out to Carol as a potential witness to the original 1998 partnership. She and Rich had grown up close, and she might reasonably have known him, and Holloway both, from that era. However it happened, Carol called me on a Sunday evening in early July, and it was not a warm call. "I hear you've come into some money," she said. "No, hello. I don't know what you've heard," I said, careful, the way Priya had coached me to be with anyone from Rich's side of the family. "There's a legal process happening. It's not finished. $8 million, Diane. $8 million my brother apparently never breathed a word of to his own sister, and you're sitting on it while some lawyer runs interference." Her voice had the particular brittleness of someone who has rehearsed a sentence in a car on the way to making a phone call. "I think you knew about this the whole time. I think you married him for exactly this. I want you to notice, because I noticed it in the moment and it steadied me, that Carol didn't ask whether I was okay, or how I was managing, or anything at all about her brother's memory. She went straight to the money and straight to an accusation 19 years of marriage should have made unnecessary. I found out 4 months ago the same way anyone would," I said. "A contractor found a key in a wall. I didn't know this account existed until the day the bank told me. That's very convenient. Carol said. It's also true, I said, and I hung up. And I called Priya at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, which she later told me was fine, because she was, in her words, already up watching a documentary about a Ponzi scheme. This is basically my hobby. 3 days later, Carol's own attorney, a man named Frank Delvecchio, who Priya described afterward as competent but overconfident in a way that usually helps us, filed a competing claim on Carol's behalf, arguing that Rich had been of diminished capacity or undue influence in the final 18 months of his life when the trust naming me sole beneficiary was finalized, and that a portion of the estate should therefore pass to Rich's surviving sibling under Ohio's intestate framework, as though the trust itself might be invalidated. It was, Priya told me flatly, a weaker claim than Holloway's, legally speaking, but a nastier one, because it's not really about money. It's about punishing you for existing. I won't pretend that period, mid-July through late August, wasn't the hardest stretch of the whole ordeal. I was fielding 2 separate legal claims against an inheritance I still hadn't been able to access a single dollar of, watching my job status get reviewed at the hospital, and picking Emma up every single afternoon and trying to make sure none of it touched her, because a 3-year-old should never have to know her grandmother is being called a manipulator by a woman who sends 1 Christmas card a year. The turning point, the document-based gotcha, as Priya took to calling it with visible relish, came in the 3rd week of August, and it came from an unexpected place. Walter Osei, the accountant, going back through 6 years of Baywood Holdings correspondence looking for the specific financial disclosures Rich had or hadn't shown Holloway before the 2018 buyout. What Walter found was an email dated 3 weeks before the buyout was finalized, from Rich's personal account to Holloway's, with a subject line that simply read, "Numbers." In it, Rich had attached a royalty projection spreadsheet, and Walter, comparing it line by line against the actual internal Baywood Holdings accounting from that same period, found that the spreadsheet Rich sent Holloway understated the prior 12 months' royalty income by roughly 40%, and projected future growth flat, when internal records showed the device's usage, and therefore the royalty stream was accelerating. It was not, Priya said carefully, proof of fraud in a criminal sense. It was, however, powerful evidence that Rich had shown his partner materially misleading numbers in the weeks before buying him out for a fraction of what the interest was actually worth, which meant Holloway's civil claim, unlike Carol's, had real legal teeth. I remember sitting in Priya's office reading that email on the screen, in my husband's own words, and feeling something complicated that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere adjacent to both. Rich had never once, in 19 years, so much as shorted a waiter on a tip. And here was proof, in his own handwriting, that he'd shorted his own business partner by roughly $2 million and never told a soul, including me. I need you to understand something, Priya said, watching me read it a 3rd time. This doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It doesn't mean the money isn't rightfully yours as his widow and beneficiary. It means your husband made a decision a long time before you found that key, and now somebody else's version of fairness has come knocking on your door to collect on it. That's not the same as you owing anybody anything. But it does mean I think we should stop fighting Holloway's claim and start talking about settling it on our terms, before a judge decides the terms for us. I trusted her. I told her to make the call. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic in the way you'd expect from a courtroom drama. It was a mediation, held on a rainy Thursday in early September in a conference room on the 9th floor of a downtown Toledo office building, the kind of room with a long table, a box of tissues nobody used, and a court-appointed mediator named Ruth Ann Delgado, who spoke so evenly and quietly that everyone in the room instinctively lowered their own voices to match hers. On one side of the table sat Priya and me. On the other, Gary Holloway himself, a heavy-set man in his late 60s with a gray mustache and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, flanked by his attorney, a younger man named Stephen Marchetti who kept a legal pad in front of him he barely wrote on. Carol Voss and her attorney, Frank Delvecchio, sat at the far end having agreed, at Priya's suggestion, and to everyone's mild surprise, to fold their claim into the same mediation session rather than run 2 separate proceedings. Ruth Ann opened by laying out, in flat administrative language, what each side was claiming and what documentation had been exchanged. Then she turned it over to the room. Holloway spoke first, and I'll say this for him. He wasn't dishonest about his own motives, which is more than I can say for Carol. I'm not here because I think Diane did anything to me, he said. looking at me directly, which I hadn't expected. "I'm here because Rich showed me numbers in 2018 that weren't true, and I signed a buyout based on those numbers, and I've spent 6 years knowing something wasn't right about it and not having the proof to do anything about it." Then she finds that key, and suddenly there's proof. Priya laid the numbers email on the table, along with Walter's line-by-line comparison. Marchetti, Holloway's attorney, barely glanced at it. He'd clearly already seen a copy, but Holloway himself picked it up and read it slowly, and I watched something in his shoulders drop, just slightly, the posture of a man confirming a wound he'd carried a long time rather than discovering a new one. "That's a 40% understatement," Walter said quietly from beside Priya. On a growth trajectory that properly disclosed would have valued Mr. Holloway's membership interest at closer to $2.1 million at the time of the buyout, not the $612,000 he received. Marchetti finally spoke, and this is the moment Priya later told me was the real turn of the mediation. Not the email itself, but what came next. "We're prepared to argue for full rescission of the buyout and reinstatement of a 50% ownership stake," he said, "which at current valuation would exceed $4 million. Priya didn't flinch. "You could argue that," she said evenly. "And you might even win some version of it in front of a judge, 18 months from now, after both our clients have spent a small fortune finding out. Or we can talk about a settlement today that reflects what the original interest was actually worth at the time of the buyout, adjusted forward for reasonable growth, minus the $612,000 already paid, which our own numbers put at $2.9 million, and which I'm authorized to offer right now. In this room, contingent on a full and final release of all claims against the Baywood Holdings Trust." There was a long silence. Holloway looked at Marchetti. Marchetti looked at his legal pad, still mostly blank, and then back at Holloway. And something passed between them that I recognized even without understanding the specifics of it. The look of a lawyer telling his client, without words, that the offer on the table was a good one and further fighting was a gamble with poor odds. "2.9, Holloway said slowly, "and I don't have to spend another year of my life on this." "Correct," Priya said. He looked at me again, and something in his face softened in a way I hadn't expected from the man who'd called my kitchen phone within hours of my bank visit. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think you knew any of this. I think Rich kept a lot of people in the dark, and I'm sorry it landed on you to clean it up." "Thank you," I said. It was the first thing I'd said out loud in the entire meeting, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. He accepted the settlement that afternoon. Carol did not have as graceful a moment when Ruth Ann turned to her and Frank Del Vecchio. Frank tried to argue the diminished capacity claim on the trust naming me sole beneficiary, and Priya simply produced Rich's full medical records from his final 18 months, obtained legally through the estate proceedings, showing no diagnosis, no cognitive concern, no medication that would remotely support a claim of impaired judgment, along with a notarized trust document signed and witnessed by an estate attorney who was still practicing and available to testify, dated 14 months before Rich's death, at which point, per every medical record on file, he was of entirely sound mind. Frank Del Vecchio looked at the medical records for a long moment, then set them down, and I watched him lean toward Carol and murmur something I couldn't hear, and I watched Carol's face go through several things in quick succession. Anger, then something like embarrassment, then a flat, resigned stillness. "We'll withdraw the claim," Frank said. Carol didn't say anything else in that room. She gathered her purse and left 11 minutes before the session officially ended, and Frank stayed just long enough to sign the necessary paperwork on her behalf. That was it. That was the whole confrontation. No raised voices, no dramatic reveal, no gavel. Just a long table, a mediator with a quiet voice, and two people who'd believed, for different reasons and to different degrees, that some piece of my husband's money belonged to them, discovering that the paperwork didn't agree. Here's exactly what I walked away with, because I think you deserve the real numbers, not a vague gesture at a happy ending. Baywood Holdings LLC and its associated trust, after Holloway's $2.9 million settlement and roughly $340,000 in combined legal, accounting, and mediation fees across 5 months of work, resolved with a net balance to me as sole surviving beneficiary of $5,502,116.39. Carol's claim was withdrawn in full, with no payment, and as part of the final release she agreed, in writing, not to pursue any further action against the trust or against me personally, Gary Holloway, for his part, walked away with his $2.9 million settlement and, as far as I know, no further connection to the Marsh family at all, though I'll tell you what became of him in a moment, because it isn't nothing. I made 3 phone calls the evening the paperwork was finalized. The first was to Kayla, who cried on the phone in a way I'd never heard her cry before, not from the money itself, but, she told me later, from finally understanding why I'd been so quiet and so careful all summer, and being able to stop worrying that something was wrong with me that I wasn't telling her. The second was to my supervisor at Mercy St. Vincent, informing her that I would be retiring from my position effective at the end of the month. Not out of spite, though I won't pretend there wasn't a small satisfaction in it, but because the restructuring review had made it clear my position wasn't valued the way 11 years should have earned, and I no longer needed it to be. The third call I made was to Priya, just to say thank you, and she answered on the second ring, mid-sip of what I can only assume was her 4th cup of coffee of the evening, and said, "Add Carol to the whiteboard, crossed out obviously, but she earns a spot." The first purchase I made with the money 3 weeks after the settlement finalized wasn't a house or a car. It was a college fund for Emma, a full $529 account, funded outright, so that whatever happens to the rest of my life, my granddaughter never has to sit across a desk from a stranger explaining that her family can't quite make the tuition number work. That was 2 years ago now. Let me tell you where everyone ended up. I sold the house on Copeland Avenue about 14 months after the settlement, not because I didn't love it, but because it had become, in a small way, a museum of 2 versions of my life I was ready to set down. The modest one I'd built for 19 years, and the strange, sudden one that Key had opened up. I bought a smaller, single-story home about 20 minutes outside Toledo, out past Sylvania, with a big kitchen and a guest room that's really Emma's room now, since she stays over most weekends. I still drive, believe it or not, a Honda. A new one, with no check engine light, because some habits you don't need $8 million to change. I didn't quit working entirely. I used part of the settlement to help Kayla put a down payment on a small house of her own, close enough that Emma is still 5 minutes from my kitchen table most afternoons, and I used another piece of it to fund something small and, I think, meaningful, a scholarship at Owens Community College, in Rich's name, for students studying mechanical engineering, the thing he was actually gifted at, underneath all the silence before I ever knew the scale of what that gift had built. Priya Anand and I still have coffee every couple of months, though these days it's her treating, because she likes to remind me she made me rich enough to buy the coffee, so the least she can do is buy it back sometimes. Her whiteboard, last I saw it, had 6 names crossed off, and I understand from her that business, unfortunately for the world and fortunately for her law practice, remains steady. Gary Holloway, as it turns out, used a portion of his settlement to finally retire from a job he'd been unhappy in for years, and this part I only know because Priya mentioned it, almost as an aside. He sent a card to the mediation office a few months later. Not to me directly, just a short note that said he hoped I was doing well and that he was sorry it had taken this long and this method to get there. I don't hold anything against him anymore. He believed he'd been wronged, and it turned out he had been, just not by me. Carol Voss and I have not spoken since that mediation room. I sent her a card at Christmas the year after, out of some old habit of civility I couldn't quite shake, and she never sent one back. I've made my peace with that. Some relationships end not with a fight, but with a silence, and I've decided that's allowed. There's a moment I keep coming back to, from about 6 months ago, sitting on the back porch of the new house on a warm evening in October, watching Emma chase fireflies across the yard while Kayla laughed at something on her phone beside me. I remember thinking that the money changed almost nothing about who I actually am. I still make lists to calm myself down. I still drive a Honda. I still fold laundry the same way my mother taught me 40 years ago, but it changed everything about what I'm afraid of. I'm not afraid of a restructuring memo anymore. I'm not afraid of a doctor's bill I can't cover, or a summer where Kayla has to choose between rent and Emma's shoes. What I learned, sitting in that mediation room and in Priya's cramped office and at my own kitchen table with cold tea in April, is that the truth, however long it takes to dig out of a hollow stud in a garage wall, is always worth more than the silence that hid it, and that the people who love you honestly will still love you once they know the whole of it. I think about Rich sometimes, still with more complication than I used to. I don't think he set out to hurt anyone. I think he was a man who built something remarkable with his hands and then, for reasons I'll never fully know, decided the world, including me, only needed to see the smallest, quietest version of him. I've made peace with not knowing why. I've decided that's allowed too. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's simple. Don't assume you know the whole shape of the people you love, even the ones you've shared a house with for 19 years. And if you ever do stumble onto a locked door in your own life, whether it's a literal key or just a question you've been too polite to ask, don't be afraid to open it. What's behind it might complicate your life. It might also eventually set you free. So tell me, if you found a hidden key in your own house tomorrow, would you want to know what it opened, even if it meant months of trouble to find out? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story kept you company today, go ahead and subscribe, so I can tell you the next one too.